Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. We are now in year 2 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war not showing any signs of letting up anytime soon. And recently, Russia detained a Wall Street journalist late last month, with Russia accusing that journalist of treason. Now, Christoph Stefes from the University of CU Denver joins us with more about what we're seeing in Ukraine, also a bit more about the journal specifically, and just kind of a bit of broad overview about what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Professor, thanks for joining us. First of all, how would you characterize the current state of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, thanks for having me again, Chris. Always glad to have a conversation about Ukraine with you. The current situation is a stalemate. So we know that the Ukrainians last fall were quite successful in regaining about 5% of their territory, but there are still about 17% of their territory that the Russians hold. Much of it they already have held since 2014, Crimea, for instance. But they have also made significant gains, of course, last year. And the Ukrainians have been able to fight back. And then for the winter and the early spring now, very little movement. Bit of fighting over the city of Bakhmut, which is located between Luhansk and Donetsk. Not really strategic. The Ukrainians don't want to give it up. Very heavy losses on both sides over the city. But all the other theaters of this war, we have not seen much movement, actually not even much of a battle. Everyone waits for Ukraine to start the spring offensive. We are not really sure when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen. We can only speculate. But this is a very decisive moment in this war.
I'll get to the spring offensive here in just a second. I want to ask about Bakhmut because we know this has been going back for a couple of months now. My understanding of it, obviously correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's not a whole lot in the way of value inherently to the city itself. It's on a big transportation hub. Is this mostly a bit more of an emotional attachment on both sides? Is that why this city is being so hotly contested right now?
That's for sure. It has a value, like emotional value, if you want to say that. But it also is, as you said, a transportation hub. And if you take Bakhmut, the way further into Ukraine is a little bit easier. Not that anything is easy right now, but it is kind of the last barrier towards a deeper push into Ukraine.
Okay, so with that said, starting with the spring offensive, you mentioned that it's been anticipated for some time. I believe there's 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers that are currently training with NATO allies overseas right now in preparation for this long anticipated offensive. I guess first things first, what would characterize as a victory for the Ukrainians in a spring offensive? Would it be severing the land bridge in the south? What would you characterize as a victory for the Ukrainians in this situation?
Of course, a big victory would be a complete pushback of the Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory. This is not going to happen, and nobody expects that to happen. Now, it depends a little bit of, where they're going to push. If they push in the south towards Mariupol, and they are able to actually divide the Russian forces into two, like in the northeast and the southeast, that would be a huge, huge success, actually. Equally, it would be a huge success if the Ukrainians were able to essentially cut off the land corridor to Crimea. A dangerous push, because Crimea is kind of the crown jewel of Putin right now. A lot of his popularity in 2014 and thereafter was built around the annexation of Crimea. So losing Crimea is for Putin, of course, not acceptable. But on the other hand, if the Ukrainians are able to isolate Crimea, maybe even making a push towards Crimea, maybe then the Russians are finally willing to come to the negotiation table. And, we might actually see a ceasefire. So the Ukrainians definitely need to make some progress here. not just militarily, but also politically, right? Because the West, I mean, I am currently in Germany as I speak with you. I find that in Europe, people are getting a little bit tired. This war has been dragging on. As you said, it's the second year now. We are into the second year, 2 years and what, 2 months, right? And people get tired, and it's not entirely clear if the political support is going to, or the military support, I should say, the military support that the Europeans and that the Americans provide, and which is crucial for Ukraine, that this is going to continue for years and years and years to come. If Ukraine cannot push right now and cannot use all the weapons that they have received from the West and use those weapons in any effective way, I fear that the West is going to turn away from Ukraine, is maybe pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, which means also losing lots of territory.
I believe you started to see the first signs that I believe French President Emmanuel Macron has started indicating that he wants to see negotiations take place between the two sides. I think it's worth asking, you mentioned the potential characterization of the success. Obviously, it seems pushing the Russians entirely back would be unrealistic, but maybe severing that land bridge from in Mariupol in the south. How realistic do you think it is, based on both sides' current situations militarily? How realistic do you think it is that the Ukrainians achieve some of those goals?
I think they're trained enough and they're motivated. Of course, they're defending their homeland. So, unlike, quite contrast to these Russian soldiers whose motivation level is pretty low. So the question is, like, how much supply is Ukraine getting? Ammunition is a huge, huge issue right now. We know that the Europeans and the Americans cannot produce ammunition for Ukraine, not even for themselves. We know that NATO supplies are currently used for Ukraine, so that might be a problem. Like providing Ukraine with weeks and weeks with ammunition. We know that tanks have been delivered, Leopard 2 from Germany and some other European NATO partners, the Abrams tank from the United States. But these are all different weapon systems which needs different ammunition. So the logistics behind this spring offensive is quite substantial. If they can master that and they get enough supplies, I think they can really push through.
How do you think President Vladimir Putin of Russia feels right now? What do you think his characterization is of the war? I know you mentioned before he's been fairly insulated. He's got a very tight circle and maybe not as aware or I don't know, as up to the current situation as maybe he was in years past.
That is interesting, because you see a lot of optimism right now on both sides, right? The Russian defense minister as well as Vladimir Putin have expressed optimism that they can actually prevail. Their reasoning is that this, in the long run, they will succeed because they just have more weapons, more soldiers, whereas Ukraine always has to rely on the West to get that support. And I think Putin is optimistic because he thinks that the West at some point gets too tired. It's a little bit of a fear that I share. I mean, for him, it's not a fear, it's a hope. And on the other side, the Ukrainians, and for political reasons, we call it in Germany, it's Zweckoptimismus. It's the idea of, like, you're optimistic so that you can convince others to be optimistic as well. And the Ukrainians, of course, are trying to be very optimistic about this and so secure the support from the West.
So I suppose the way I always like to kind of think about this is, what do you think prompts a solution or an end to this war quicker? Is it a continued stalemate where eventually the support from the West erodes for Ukraine and essentially the Ukrainians are forced to the negotiating table, or a successful spring offensive here from the Ukrainians, which forces the Russians to to the negotiating table? Which do you think would be quicker and or more realistic?
I think the solution here is not just between Ukraine and Russia. For instance, today, for the first time, the Chinese president has talked to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. That's the first telephone call they've had since February of last year, since the start of the war. I think China plays a really, really crucial role here. If China can convince Putin to end this war, because it's maybe too costly also for China, economically speaking, that would be a huge step. Then when you look at the alliances, yeah, sure, we see a lot of support for Ukraine, but we also see many, many countries such as South Africa, such as Brazil, such as India, and to some degree also China, who are, let's put it, they are neutral. They don't really provide too much support for Russia, but they also don't provide any support for Ukraine. If you could convince them to play a more active role as a mediator here, or maybe even threatening Russia that they would start supplying Ukraine with, you know, guns and ammunition and tanks and warplanes, whatever is needed, then maybe you can force Putin to come to the negotiation table. But just the situation as it is on the battlefield, I don't see that any side is willing at this point to come to the negotiation table. Both sides think that they can actually win this war. And I don't see it, but there's hope on both sides. There's a lot of optimism. So we will see how this plays out over the next few months, but the next few months are going to be very costly for both sides, that's for sure.
So really, the next few months will likely decide the fate of the war one way or the other?
I think so. I think we have reached what we call a critical juncture, a very important point, where, you know, it's going either one way or the other way. And I think by fall of this year, we will know a whole lot more how this war and when this war will end.
Okay, well, I guess we'll leave it at that then there, Professor Stefes. We appreciate a few minutes of your time and letting us your expertise and your insight about the current conflict. And thanks again for joining us and giving us a few minutes of your time.
Thank you.